everyone. Welcome to Code to Cloud, right? And on this episode, we're talking about platform engineering. And I've brought in the Radius squad, right, from Microsoft. I'm really excited about this product. Platform engineering as a concept and as a technology is really gaining traction. You know, there's a whole dilemma and conversations around DevOps versus platform engineering and how that all works, because like anything to do with cloud, we're sort of demystifying it as we go along, right? Which makes a lot of sense. So we brought in the product team, right? So I'm just gonna hand it over to a quick round of introductions, and we're gonna get a look into how the Radius tool works and how it's involved with platform engineering as a concept. So Ryan, do you want to take us off?
I'll go first. Hey, I'm Ryan. I work at
Yeah,
Microsoft, and I work. We'll talk a little bit more about the team and what we do, but I work on open source. I've been working on open source at Microsoft for about 10 years now. I'm the creator of a project called Radius that we'll be talking about today. And with me is Aaron.
Hey, I'm Aaron Crofus. I also work in the open source space here at Microsoft. We work on a team called Azure Incubations. So if you ever heard of a couple different open source projects, such as CADA, Kubernetes Event-Driven Autoscaling, COPA, Project Copacetic for container patching, Dapper, the distributed application runtime, or even going back to like Open Application Model or a couple other smaller things. I've been working in this space for about 5 years and have a little bit of background in back in Azure core security services as well. So kind of worked on different parts of the cloud native stack over my years.
amazing. Will.
Hey everyone, my name is Will. I also work on the same team as Aaron and Ryan in the Azure Incubations team. I also work on various open source projects, including Project Radius, which I was fortunate enough to get involved with in 2023. So looking forward to speaking with everybody today on it.
Amazing. And I always skip over my own introduction, right? I've got a really bad habit of it. So, you know, for folks that haven't seen the show before or watched an episode, I am Kevin Evans. I am the host of Code to Cloud. I'm also a cloud solution architect at Microsoft as well in North America. So who's gonna give us the overview, right, of what was the motivation for Radius and how it got started?
Aaron, is
I
that
think
you?
since Ryan, you've probably been with the project from the. Yeah, I don't know. I'm happy to do, but I know Ryan, you picked this up probably what 2020.
That can be me. So the idea of something like Radius was kind of conceived around the same time as another project called Dapper that my team built and incubated and is now kind of out there in the open source world and has really taken off. And some of the big ideas that are here are like, well, there's an idea as old as time, which is if you're a developer and you're targeting the cloud, you're building cloud native kinds of applications, what can we do to make your job easier? What can we do to give you fewer things to worry about? Ideally, less code to write. And I think the biggest idea is what are the things that as developers we're not experts on? There are other experts in the organization that understand those things, and how can we work better to them? I don't think we didn't really have the term platform engineering at the time. And so it's kind of a coincidence of timing that there's a discussion in the industry right now about platform engineering. And I think these two projects started together, Dapper, and then something called Ohm that kind of, for as far as our involvement is concerned, became Radius over time. Dapper was about how can you write better code that uses cloud resources, key value stores, message queues, make it easier for you to write programs that interact with the cloud, and kind of abstracts away the differences between different kinds of things you might use. So if you need a key value store, you could use something like Redis. You could also use something like DynamoDB. And that's on the application code and behavior side. With Radius, we wanted to do the same thing, but for how you describe and deploy applications. So within your application, you might need a Redis cache, or you might be using Dapper, or you might need a SQL database or something like that. And as developers, like, we don't necessarily know how to create a Redis cache on Azure, AWS, or on premises that's going to have all the right security settings, that's going to do things in the way that, you know, our corporate overlords and people who are responsible for the operations of the cloud really understand. And so that was kind of the genesis of Radius, is like, how can we give you a way to talk about the requirements of your application and then use those assets as part of the deployment maintenance of the application and kind of help everybody who needs to support that code and that running service work together.
I really like that. It's always like the eternal struggle, as I like to call it, right? Developers want to run their code, but then infrastructure's either trying to catch up or try not to be a blocker, right? And deploy things in a secure way and everything else, right? It's an issue that we face every day. So I like the fact that
That's
the
right.
concepts around, the
That's right.
concepts
And
around.
it might seem kind of motherhood and apple pie, but like if you think about everybody who's building tools in the industry, like really what we want is for everybody to have a better time doing their job, be happy and more successful, do the things that bring you joy, and you're an expert on, and let the other experts in your organization do the things that they're experts for and they're kind of set up to be responsible for. I think part of what we wanted to do with Radius is we wanted to have conversations more about applications and architecture and the way that developers see the world. As we talk to Azure customers and other sort of cloud users and just the developer community at large, we've kind of seen two approaches to that. One approach has been a lot of organizations have given the developers the keys to everything and said, all right, you guys are smart, you figure it out, right? Go create what you need to create. And then usually a couple of years later, it's kind of chaos. Nobody knows like why was this server created? It's really expensive. Do we know what's running on? Oh no, we don't. Okay, we had no rules in place about how we were going to secure things, so we followed 5 different sets of practices. The other model that we've seen a lot is everything is really locked down. And so if you work somewhere where they're very operationally strong, you might have to like file a ticket, right? Hey, we're putting a new application in production. We need a database. You have to file a ticket, wait for somebody to get back to you. And we're trying to split the difference between those models so you don't end up in either of those bad places. We want to unlock your productivity and your ability to do things on demand, but we still want to let the people who should be in control be in control. So we'll show some of that stuff when we get further in. Those are some of the big ideas we're working with.
It sounds like my day-to-day life. I'll be quite honest, right? So I like the analogy of the server. I used to call it the mythical beast, like the Taurus and the labyrinth, right? Because it was running, it really had an important job, but no one knew what it did, and it cost an absolute, fortune to maintain, operate, and no one wanted to touch it either, right? It was like the last person that SSH'd into it or logged onto it, it was their fault if anything went down. So
what was the not too long ago, I think there was some organization that just had like some sort of like server, or maybe it was a Mac Mini just running in a closet, and they were like, don't touch it, it's important. And then it's like, oh, because there's a little post-it note that says don't turn this off. And then I think someone finally went in and then turned it off, and then it turned out it was like their VPN architecture for their organization, so all their work from home employees weren't able to
that's
VPN.
crazy.
And so we see that all the time with like Radius customers that we've talked to, is like, just like Ryan was saying, they give like owner permission in Azure or like root user permissions in AWS. And there's all this stuff, and it belonged to a team from a while ago, but we're not sure. So we just let it like do its thing, and maybe we'll poke it and like try to turn it off and see if anyone complains. So we realized that we needed to, on the both extremes of manual tickets and fully locked down, and then just do what you need to do. There needed to be a better way for that.
It's music to my ears, put it that way, because I was the guy that turned it off, right? But yeah,
I think the other thing Radius is kind of a response to is growing complexity, right? And you think about appreciating
that's
some of
right.
the jobs that people do and how people's jobs have gotten more complicated. Roles have gotten more specialized, right? How many different ops roles can we name, right? We could name FinOps, SecOps, like Cloud Center of Excellence, platforming. There's lots of different roles we can name. And if we look at projects like Kubernetes is great. It's really powerful. Some people go super deep. They learn everything. Some people are kind of like, and there are whole companies that don't really want to dive in there and don't want to become experts. And then there are some companies that want to have a division of labor around it. And then there are some companies that want everybody to learn it. And not everybody can, and maybe not everybody has to. And so a large part of kind of what we're trying to capture with Radius is like, what's a developer's level of understanding? And I think I'd hope that if you're
Right.
if you're a developer and you're thinking about Radius, like if you can understand Docker Compose, I hope you can understand Radius. If you're the kind of person that like, oh, I can set up a Docker Compose file, but I never really learned Kubernetes, like I'm really interested what you think. If you feel like this is just right, then I feel like I've done my job super well.
I like that. Simple is sometimes the best approach, right? You get a group of engineers in a room. What do? They over-engineer something, right? So that's something I've been sort of chasing the past couple of years as well with the whole Kubernetes conversation. Was what do I need to know for my job, right? Because as soon as you open the door on that thing, you get a different opinion from everybody. Everyone in the industry's got a different take on it. It's very, very complex. So yeah, I really relate to that personally as well.
No, when you mentioned the like if you put a bunch of developers in a room and they start to think about an application, like even from like the very beginnings of Radius, we always were thinking about those whiteboard diagrams. Like if you put like a bunch of engineers and developers in a room with a whiteboard, it's like, well, here's all the services and the databases and the message queues and all these things. And so you'll see kind of throughout Radius this like kind of idea that like what if we could take that whiteboard diagram and like that's the application. So very often applications are like, here's your infrastructure, here's your Kubernetes objects, here's your infrastructure as code, and you just kind of like building a brick wall. You go layer by layer by layer by layer, and you get like your app at the end of the day. But what if you could just turn that completely upside down and say, here's what I want to build, and then like work your way down into the infrastructure from the top down. So there's Radius has gone through many iterations where for the longest times, like our fonts and our diagrams were all like using like whiteboard style visuals there because, and you'll still see a lot of parts of that kind of have carried over.
Well, yeah, sometimes that's more receptive on the eye, right? When you look at something, it just fits better. But I wanted to, you touched on cloud native before, right? So I have a lot of involvement with the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, right? It's part of the Linux Foundation, as we know. It's a big organization globally, and they're the custodians of Kubernetes and other cloud native technology. So how does Radius fit into that? 'Cause I thought it was like a Microsoft offering, right? So are you getting it into the Cloud Native Computer Foundation? Is it getting adopted? How's that working? Is it open source?
Do you mind if I take this one, Aaron?
Yeah, go for it.
So first of all, Radius is an open source project. It's not a product that Microsoft is building. So if you look at
interesting,
if you look at kind of what we're doing with Radius, we'll have some links for ways that people can get involved later. It really is an open source project rather than a product. Like you're not going to see a service pop up in Azure in the short term anytime soon. I think if Radius really takes off, it's something that the business people will want to consider. But that's not really why we're doing it. Like there isn't something to go sign up for, just to be super clear. And where we are in that kind of open source journey is we've submitted Radius to CNCF. We haven't called for a vote on that yet. It hasn't been accepted into CNCF yet. A big part of the reason why we take a step like that is, first of all, that's the mission of my team at Microsoft. So we sit in the Azure CTO's office. We work with Mark Rusinovich, the Azure CTO, and we incubate technology that's focused on improving the state of the art in the industry rather than improving Microsoft's bottom line. So you might be kind of shocked to hear that, like, well, Radius is actually a multi-cloud project. Like, we want to help you do AWS if AWS is the thing that you're doing. And you might be surprised to see a bunch of Microsoft engineers talking about that. As we've had these sort of conversations with platform engineers across the industry, we learned that platform engineering basically everywhere is a multi-cloud effort. It's really the people who are working in operations and platform engineering get exposed to the choices of everybody that came before them. And so your favorite cloud might be Azure, your favorite cloud might be AWS or GCP or one of the other ones like IBM or Oracle. But if you work at a big company, there's a chance that you're working with multiple clouds. And it's kind of unfortunate that the tools we have don't work consistently the same way, right? Like there aren't a lot of tools that you could use to do both AWS and Azure. Kubernetes is one of those things, right? Because Kubernetes is kind of the same everywhere. But it can be hard to use Kubernetes with all the other things you need. Kubernetes is great for your compute, networking, storage. What about your secret store, your message queues, your databases? And so we want to help you work with all of that stuff, manage all that infrastructure, no matter what cloud you're on. So the stage that Radius is at, I mentioned this as kind of context for what we're doing. The stage that Radius is at is this is at the right point for you to check it out, give us feedback, let us know if you think we're on the right track, if these are the right ideas. I think we're looking to move Radius to a place where people can use it in production, but we're not quite there yet. If people want to take the plunge, give us feedback and go on that journey, we're looking for people to help us. And we're looking for people to contribute and to partner if you think that these are the right ideas. So I like to think about this as something that's open source first. It's primarily a project, not a product. If it really takes off, it might become a product somewhere down the line. And this is where an organization like CNCF comes in. So what we're doing by putting a project like Dapper, like Kata, like Radius, and CNCF is we're basically saying Microsoft cannot strong arm this project. Once it's in an organization like CNCF, CNCF actually owns the code at the end of the day. And so Microsoft can't take people's contributions and then take them in a direction that the community would be really unhappy with. And I think if we're successful, we're going to invite some other partners to come work on the project with us as equals. I think that's what we'd like to do. It's more about the industry and the kinds of things we're doing as a whole than it is about yet another product or service.
I really like the way that you clarified that, especially with some of the news that's been happening over the past couple of months, right? With certain products. We won't mention any names, right? But it's for the benefit. It's for the benefit of all, right? Rather than Microsoft has come a long way. I've talked about this a lot, right? In the past around open source contributions and all that kind of good stuff. But I like the fact that you're positioning it as a tool, right, rather than a SKU, right, or as an offering. Yeah. So, my advice for people, let's say, when you say take the plunge, I mean that's cloud native in a box, right? You take the plunge with everything, right? So, go and check it out, go and try it. I like the website. We'll touch on how people can get involved towards the end, but I noticed there was a Discord channel there, right, and all that kind of good stuff. But
and the nice part, within kind of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, one of our big goals is that Radius just kind of fits into the tools and the technologies and the platforms that you're already using. So we'll get into in the demo in a little bit, kind of about these things called recipes and some of the parts of Radius. But we wanted it to work seamlessly with things like Dapper, which we consider to kind of be the perfect complement of write your code with Dapper, deploy it and manage it with Radius, kind of like the peanut butter and jelly. They're great separate, but when you put peanut butter and jelly, but when you put them together, they really shine as part of the perfect sandwich. But the same thing with other projects like Radius works with Bicep, which is another open source project out of Microsoft. It works with Terraform. We're doing experiments right now with continuous delivery, a lot of community requests for things like Argo CD. We're working with Kubernetes being the big one as our first platform, but also looking at other platforms there as well. So yeah, we wanted it to not be a replacement for all of your things. Go throw out all the years of stuff you've been working on and start with a blank slate and fit in Radius. And it's just meant to be a way to kind of build that platform around what you're already doing in a lot of ways, which we'll get into, I'm sure, as part of the demo and as the conversation.
I like the way that you said that. There was some big names there, right? Bicep, we got Terraform. They're the main infrastructure deployment tools that we see, right? Especially across Azure. When it comes to multi-cloud deployments, again, we're bringing those friends along, right, onto the journey, right? So if you're in AWS or GCP, it's not an issue, right? So what have you been hearing from our customers though, like, and the community around this? I know you mentioned a little bit, like, no one wants to start again, because how many times has sales rep turned up with a cart full of new stuff and said, that old stuff, you don't need it anymore, right? You've got to use this new stuff. I mean, what are you hearing from our customers around platform engineering and how Radius will fit into that?
So some of the most I've had at this point probably about 70 cloud customer conversations, and a lot of these are coming from they're kind of leads that are coming from Azure field. So most of these are Azure customers in some regard. We're seeking out people that are multi-cloud. So we're not necessarily trying to make Radius as something that is like, oh, if you're an Azure loyalist or you're a Microsoft loyalist, you're going to love this, and if you're everybody else, you can just skip it. We're actually doing the opposite. We're looking for folks that have a pretty complicated management problem. What we're seeing is across all of those companies, almost everybody's got a platform engineering department now. Kind of, if you're at a big enough company, you probably got a platform engineering department. I think if you're small companies, they're still trying to figure out if that kind of separation and team structure makes sense. And the cool thing that we're seeing is they're really digging deep and thinking about what responsibilities do we want developers to have in our organization, and how are we going to build a platform that makes people productive, allows us to control the things that we need to control, and allows developers to focus on the parts of the job that they're really excel at. So it's mostly these teams that we're talking to. It's mostly the platform engineers. Pretty universally, what happens is we go into these places and they're like started to build their own platform to kind of act as glue between all the technologies that they've already decided to use and all the things that they're already successful with. So it's kind of like, we found the model we like for applications. Let's make it easier to build them and maintain them. And that's where platform engineering comes in. And a lot of their work is done through things like building portals. They might build on top of Backstage. They might do a custom build of a kind of internal developer portal. There's a lot of templating. And there's a lot of discussion and debate about like what should go in the repo that the developers work on versus what should go somewhere else that the developers don't see and don't touch. I think one of my favorites is, in a lot of cases, the more progressive folks we're talking to are taking away like CI/CD authoring from devs, which like, hey man, like I hate working on pipelines. I find it so tedious. So that's pretty exciting. What we're hearing a lot about Radius, everybody's really concerned about drift and version management. So as soon as you take your kind of cloud infrastructure management from being a ticketing based system to a on-demand based system, or to a system where the developers have a little bit more control, everybody's really concerned about versioning, upgrades, updates, and drift. Everybody's really concerned and anxious about like, okay, if I've got people going to the portal and doing ClickOps, somebody had to change the logging settings, or they couldn't connect to that database, so they changed the firewall rules. How does that get detected? How does that get repaired? That's really top of mind for everybody. They want to take the plunge to have an on-demand model for how their developers interact with infrastructure, but they also want to make sure that those things can be governed, use the right templates to create them. They can be versioned and updated, and they can be repaired if something goes wrong, or somebody had permissions to something they shouldn't. That needs to be fixed automatically. I think one of the other things is platform engineering across enterprise is often kind of fighting for attention. They've made like, okay, here's the right way to do logging. Here's where we want your metrics to go. We're building a hub for diagnostics, and we're trying to get everybody to use the thing that we've chosen as an organization. They often are struggling a little bit politically, like, we don't quite have the tools to force you to do this. We don't have the power to force you to use the solution that we've built, but it would be better for everybody if you did it. So how can we help you? Like, how can we make that the easiest thing so that you choose it? Is really where a lot of these folks are sitting. And I think the hope is that with something like Radius, we can be part of that platform effort. So I don't think that Radius is a full solution in terms of like, you're not going to fire all of your platform engineers. Those people are valuable and they still have work to do. But I hope that we're contributing to that effort, and I hope that we're contributing around things like making it easy. So it should be easy for you to get up and running. It should be easy for you to stay running. For the folks that work in platform engineering, it should be easy for you to have the developers opt into those defaults, control those defaults, and kind of reason about like, where are people following the guidance versus where are they not following the guidance. So that's kind of how I see Radius fitting in there.
Yeah, and the on the guidance piece, it's been interesting. So many of the of the customers we've talked to have built, whether it be like bicep modules or Terraform modules, or just there's like, here's like scaling horizontally the number of like templates and modules, and then it's kind of left to the developer to go like, okay, how do I know what I need? Let me go pull this module off the shelf, and then just wiring it up. Like, okay, I pulled this module off the shelf for like an Azure app service or a container app or something like that, and now I need to pass in the VNet ID and the log analytics like endpoint, and there's like all these like list of things. And if you ever looked at like a bicep parameter file, you can just see it like endlessly scroll into the abyss. So one of the things that Radius is focused on that Ryan mentioned is just making it easy, which is, if your platform engineering team says, here's how we do logging with log analytics, here's how we do network isolation with virtual networks, and here's how we do any other number of kind of standard practices, developers can go and pick and choose kind of those building blocks or those like Lego pieces of like, well, I need a container, I need a Redis cache, I need a MongoDB. And they just kind of fit together using the Radius platform. So it's not a, let me like before, it's not like building that brick wall like layer by layer and like putting the mortar in between the cracks. It's just, no, let me pick the pieces I need and just let Radius make sure that it all fits together at deploy time. So that's a big thing that we're focusing on, is just kind of improving the state of the art, which is, here's a bicep module with like 50 parameters you have to set.
I mean,
I want to add.
Go for it, Will.
I want to add that a benefit of this structured way of thinking of how to wire an app together brings about the benefit of better documentation, right? Because in the world where like developers are left to their own devices wiring everything up, it's painful enough to wire everything up. It's even more painful to document it accurately. And when things break, people are left wondering, oh, how does this thing even work, right? It's a Frankenstein of an app that is not well documented. And with Radius, with a structured approach to defining an app, the documentation like just happens as a side effect of you wiring everything up. So it really lends itself to some powerful use cases that we can use for the application graph and visualization and documentation.
I mean, everything that you're saying is experiences that I've had, right? And I've come from an infrastructure and security background, right? And deploying stuff as infrastructure as a code. And I can just see it making my life easier already. Because I'm already using Copilot to write my documentation, right? Because I'm not the best, right? How, like you said, all the networking IDs, right? Like that's a request that we get, you know. Developer just cares about the resource that it's deploying its code to service that service. Yeah. All the connectivity and security and identity that wraps around all of that, right? It's complex and goes very deep very quickly, especially when you're writing it in code as well. So I'm sort of looking forward to this. It sounds like we might look back in a couple of years and go, how did we ever live without Radius? By the sounds of things, right? Because if the objective is
I'm really happy. Like one of the key themes, and I think Will and Aaron and you both kind of act this, is making the explicit or making the implicit explicit. Like today, if you're going to use OpenTelemetry to send metrics to Azure Monitor or AWS CloudWatch, like where is that clear? Like, you know what I mean? Like where do I look if I want to find out where those logs are going or where those metrics are going? Like I think with the current state of the art, I'd have to maybe look for like an OpenTelemetry configuration inside of a Kubernetes cluster. I think one of the ideas in Radius that's resonated the most with platform engineering and operations minded people is this concept of environment. Environment is in like, what is the thing I'm deploying to? And I think when we look at the Kubernetes ecosystem, this isn't really meant to be a criticism. I'm kind of showing up late and giving this feedback, but we look at the Kubernetes ecosystem, we kind of like the concept we have to work with is the cluster in Kubernetes. So we kind of equate like the cluster is the thing that I'm deploying to. Well, what if you're using the same cluster for multiple purposes, right? It's going to have different, you need different configurations for dealing with those kinds of things. And how do you reason about all the things that are external to Kubernetes, but are like, they're semantically part of the environment you're deploying to? So that's kind of how we're using that concept in Radius, is like, we would just in a really clear way say like, logs are here, right? Metrics are here. Rather than that being buried in some configuration passed to a tool. And hopefully that comes across for folks as we look at this a little bit more.
Yeah, and like just like Ryan was saying, when we think about Radius, like we think of the application as kind of like that whiteboard diagram of, well, here are my front end and back end and my gateways and SQL and Redis. But to Ryan's point is, well, the environment is more than just the cluster. Like the cluster is a big part of it. Like that's where any sort of Kubernetes services deployments and all of that get like sent to. But it's also going to be the infrastructure. And that could be in Kubernetes, could be outside. So for example, in this example, your application might be deploying to like a local development environment. Maybe it's running on Minikube or K3s or one of the different like a kind cluster on your development machine. And so that way you want to use kind of those lightweight. That's all in Kubernetes. It's all lightweight, gets you up and running. But the nice part about Radius environments is that you just swap out the environment, and now you might be running on Azure Kubernetes service, but you're also using Azure Cache for Redis and Azure SQL DB. So that environment can describe more than just those Kubernetes pieces. And this diagram doesn't show it, but like this could include all of your open telemetry configuration and your networking. Like the environment, we really want it to be that landing zone where everything that the application needs to actually go off and run lives, so that way the environment can become swappable, and the application, when you use it with kind of these portable things like Redis or SQL or even things like Dapper, you just swap out the environment and swap out the recipes, which dictate kind of how things get spun up across different clouds. And so now you have an application that can really run anywhere. And so we see Radius as a lot giving developers the pieces to describe their apps, and then operators the ability to describe their environments. So yeah, I just wanted to throw some quick visuals up there to
throw. It's always better.
Really
it's always better, right? To have a picture. Yeah. No, it's good to have a picture sometimes, right? A picture paints 1,000 words. But no, this is really interesting. I really like the approach. Now, have you got a demo for us? Right? Because I know that's what people will want to be seeing, right? I know we've talked about it. They'll be like, where's the demo? Where's the demo? Because I'm interested.
Let me find my window here.
I've got loads of basic questions. Hopefully they'll be relevant.
I hope so. Let me set up what we're going to see today. There's a lot of stuff in Radius, so we can only really give you kind of a basic tour, and I hope in this demo we're covering a little bit of kind of everything that's here, so you can get a flavor for it. I love questions. Like please ask whatever questions you got. Just interrupt me, shout at me, whatever makes sense. And the thing that I'm going to be showing today, I hope it's a little bit of a wow, is we're going to take an application that I've already written. I'm going to deploy that to a Kubernetes cluster that's running locally. So I've kind of got a cluster set up for dev. It's not in the cloud. It's just inside this code space. And then I've also got environments set up in Azure. So there's an AKS cluster in Azure, and there's an EKS cluster in AWS. I'm going to take the same application, and I'm not going to modify any of the code or any of the deployment manifests. And we're going to use Redis as our database for this demo, and we're going to see Redis in 3 different forms. So as we deploy to these different environments, not only are we going to have like a different networking environment, a different flavor of Kubernetes, but we're also going to have different cloud resources. Now they're all playing the role of Redis here, because you can kind of run Redis in a lot of different ways. But this hopefully gives you a bit of a flavor of like, well, no matter what clouds I need to use, might be one, might be multiple, like I can have tools that understand and know how to work with those clouds, regardless of which one I'm using. And they also cover sort of the local scenario to the cloud. I think how do I test apps is something that we don't always talk enough about. And the more you can make your testing
Right.
like production, the better your testing is going to be. So with that, I'm going to kind of dive in. And I'm running in a code space here. I really like code spaces for playing with Radius. I think one of the hardest things we can do is run Kubernetes locally, especially if you're new. It's just one of the hardest things to do. All of the distros of Kubernetes that you can run locally, everybody's got their favorite. They all work a little bit differently. If you're totally new to this space, we've got a code space set up you can use. It's free. You don't have to pay anybody anything. And that's the best way for you to try this out. If you go to our docs, you'll kind of see something like the setup that I'm using. And the way that I would get started, so I'm in this code space. I've got a Kubernetes cluster running. There's going to be a little bit of lag with me typing, so I'll just do my best. So I'm going to run a kubectl cluster info just to prove that I've got a Kubernetes cluster here. So you can see I've got a local Kubernetes cluster. I think I'm using K3s here, which is one of my favorites.
Right.
I'm also a big
Yeah.
fan of Kind. And the way that I would get started with Radius, I've got Radius installed. It's a CLI tool that you can download. I'll run this command rad init. Rad init sets up a cluster for development purposes. If you want to set up for production, we've got some other ways to do that you can find in the docs. And this is going to do things like install Radius on the Kubernetes cluster. It's going to create a kind of default configuration for you. It's going to create an environment for you so you can deploy applications. And the thing that it's going to do that I'll show you in a sec when this finishes is it's going to install recipes for local development. I'm going to say yes because I do have an application here. That went pretty fast because I've already got Radius installed on this cluster. In your actual experience, it'll take a minute. And this will include recipes for local dev. So I'll do a rad recipe list just to show you that. And you don't have to understand all of this output. I think the thing to focus on is maybe this column here. You can see that we've got recipes that come with Radius for a bunch of technologies. So we've got one for SQL, we've got one for RabbitMQ, we've got some of the major building blocks in Dapper, we've got MongoDB, we've got Redis caches. And the purpose of these recipes is to get you up and going kind of for development. You can see from these, it's kind of hard to read because it line wrapped here, but these are the local dev recipes. These are part of the open source project. And there's going to be a growing set of technologies that we have recipes for. You kind of think about that as an easy way to get started if you're just doing development or testing. And then when I go to Azure and AWS, I'm actually going to have different recipes. So I'll show that right now for Azure. And I'm going to use this W flag to target Azure and kind of say, what do I have in Azure? So in Azure, I've got a recipe for Redis cache, and we're going to be using Redis in this demo. So you kind of think about this as like, well, if I'm developing and I'm going to run it some integration tests, I'm probably choosing the recipes myself, probably using stuff that came from open source because I'm not an expert on this. If I'm going to production in Azure or AWS, whoever is an expert in that set this up. And that could mean that they wrote the recipe. That could mean that they just chose it from open source. However you think about making those choices today, we want you to still make those same choices. But just know that, like, I can have a Redis cache in both these environments.
Yeah, and earlier we were talking about being able to reuse a lot of the existing assets that you have. So if you have existing Bicep modules, if you have existing Terraform modules, things for, well, this is how we already deploy things like Azure Cache for Redis.
Yeah.
You just plug them right in as a recipe. We have a guide on how to take existing modules, and it's very easy to get them set up as recipes. And now this is exactly how those just plug in. Developers can pick and choose from the list here.
I already like the CLI syntax for Radius. Rad init. I don't know where you got the inspiration from, right? But it's a very, very, very good way of moving forward. I'll let you continue, Ryan.
Some other things that happen. I just want to show you. I've got a Docker file here, and I've got some code. This is a to-do application. I think to-do applications are traditional for this kind of demo. We're using Redis in this demo. This application can actually do a bunch of different technologies because we use this to kind of teach people about Radius. So I've got a Docker file, and I'm just showing this Docker file because I've already containerized and pushed this application. So however you're doing this today, we want you to keep doing it that way. Radius isn't asking you. One of a couple things that Radius isn't asking you to change. Another thing that we're not asking you to change is how you write code. So you'll see that, and again, this demo supports a couple different technologies. We're going to be using Redis for the demo, but you can see that I'm just reading an environment variable here in TypeScript. And so if you're familiar with 12-factor, if you're writing cloud native applications today, you're probably doing a lot of work with environment variables, reading them and passing data around and things like that, injecting settings rather than hard coding them. Like, we're not asking you to change that. There's no magic here. There's no SDK for you to use Radius. We don't want you to change the way you're writing code. If you do want to change the way you're writing code, look at Dapper, which is a little bit more in this space. But this is not a Dapper demo. So just to kind of show you some of the things that happen behind the scenes, I think Radius becomes interesting to you as a developer at the point where you've got some working code and you want to see it work with like real dependencies in a production-like environment. The other thing that I've got here is I've got an app.bicep. And so if you remember when I ran rad init, it asked me if I had an application in this directory. And if I say yes, it's going to spit out this file. So we scaffold for you a starting point for describing your application. And that's just a way to get you started. Like, I think the blank canvas can be really daunting, especially if you're new to the language and the tools. Like, if we just give you something really blank, it starts to feel kind of scary. And what we're doing here is we scaffold for you a configuration that's going to run our tutorial app. It's going to listen on the right port. This is a container that we built and published as part of the Radius project. Conveniently for me, I created the demo, so it's the same container we're going to be using for the demo. If you're thinking about doing this with your real app, you would take this file and start customizing it. And so if you're new to all this, I'll kind of give a primer on it in a sec, but if you're new to all this and it seems like a lot, I'd say just focus your attention here on what's going on inside this container. If I trigger completion here, you should see a lot of things you're probably familiar with, like volumes, working directory, command line arguments, environment variables, health checks. If you're comfortable with something like Docker Compose, or maybe you're already comfortable with Kubernetes, you'll find that this is pretty similar. There's kind of a consensus of features that these container platforms support, and that's what we're doing inside of Radius. So if I were doing this for an application that I built without Radius in mind, I might need to do some things like set some environment variables. I might have a health check that I want the orchestrator to call, things like that. And I would go ahead, my job would be to describe my application using that. I don't need to do that coincidentally for this demo. I want to talk a little bit about Bicep because I think Bicep is one of the really truly experimental things that we're doing with Radius. I know, Kevin, you said you have some experience with Terraform and other infrastructure as code, and I think
Bicep. Yeah.
Bicep, not Terraform. Okay. We don't think about.
Oh no, both.
We don't always,
I do both.
Both. Okay. Good. We don't always think about infrastructure as code as being a developer tool. We might think about infrastructure as code as being a little bit more on the ops side. If you're a developer, you might be more or less comfortable with these kinds of tools. So one of the interesting things that we're doing here is we're using an infrastructure as code language to describe an application instead of describing a piece of cloud infrastructure. And it's a little bit of an abstraction. Like, we're trying to get this to work at kind of a developer's level of understanding in the way that they think about their application. Now, Bicep isn't the only way to do Radius. You can also do Radius from Helm, and I can show a demo of that really quickly when we get a little bit further into here. But my really brief primer, if this is new to you, if you're coming from a Terraform background, this probably looks and feels very familiar to you. I don't think that there are any tricks or traps if you're coming from a Terraform background. Your naive understanding of this file is probably pretty accurate. Import Radius as Radius is basically saying I'm using Radius as a library. So don't think of Bicep as like Bicep is the thing that Radius does. It's actually the opposite. Like, Bicep is a tool for automating infrastructure, and you can use that to automate Radius. We think it's a great tool for describing apps and that's why we picked it for a radius. There's also some parameters that are being passed in here. Radius is going to pass in some context when you deploy this file to tell you kind of what's the application name, what's the environment that I'm deploying to. This is the info that you'd usually pass in at the command line. So you'll see me later saying like, oh, I want to deploy to my environment in Azure. So this is context that gets passed in from the command line. And you can define your own parameters here. Like if you wanted to have a different number of replicas in a region where you get a lot more traffic, you can do that with parameters. Everywhere that you see this resource keyword, we're creating a thing. So this is like declaring a container. Everything that we create has a variable name that's here. It's got a type. So the type that we're using is a container. Everything that's defined in this application's namespace is something that's provided by Radius. And then these also have versions. And then the properties is kind of really where everything comes in. So that's a description of a container. I also mentioned that this app is going to use Redis, and I'm just going to code that up right now. So we're going to add another resource because we're going to create another thing. I'm going to create a variable called db so that I can reference it here in the file. And then, oh, that failed. That's interesting. Let's see if this will work. Stores Redis caches. I don't know why my tooling is on the fritz. I'm having some trouble with completion here. And so I'm going to just copy paste the API version. Normally what I'd want to show you is some of the other things that are available. Maybe I'll try doing that in a different way. There we go. Now it's happy. Yeah, it's having real trouble with completion. So I'm going to create a Redis cache. We're defining a bunch of different types as part of the Radius project for things that we call standard resources. We sometimes call them portable resources. You can think about these as things that are going to be dependencies of your application, the things that your application code needs to work, like I need a Redis cache, I need a MongoDB, I need a Dapper state store. And you're sort of declaring that you have a dependency on this. We call them standard resources because we're not declaring a dependency on any specific cloud resource. It's kind of like the idea of a Redis cache. It's an abstraction, right? You could host that Redis cache in a variety of different ways, just like you could have a Mongo compatible database or a SQL Server compatible database. Like that could be RDS on Amazon. That could be a Microsoft service on Azure. It could be SQL in a container. That's what we mean by portable resources, right? Your code doesn't probably care which of those hosting models you're using. And so as a developer, you shouldn't have to care which of those hosting models you're using. I need to give this a name. I'm going to name it DB. I'm really sad about the completion not working here. And I'm going to declare some properties. There, it's happy with the properties. The two things that I need to pass in is I need to say what application this belongs to, so I'll use the parameter for that. And I need to say what environment this belongs to, and I'll use the parameter for that. And we're not done with this. We're going to polish it a little bit more. I kind of want to get rid of this because it's just boilerplate. So if you want to mentally collapse that, pretend it doesn't exist, I'm fine with that. Like I said, this is open source. It's pretty new. We're still working on it. But I'm actually done defining my Redis cache. And that's the thing that I think is kind of cool about this is like, you'll notice what I didn't have to say. I didn't say what SKU to deploy. I didn't say how to configure the firewall. I didn't say even like what cloud service to use. I didn't have to get that specific because I'm trusting that when I deploy this, the environment that I'm deploying to is going to have the right recipe. So when I go to local dev, I'm going to get the local dev recipe. It's going to create the Redis cache using that local recipe. When I go to AWS, it's going to do that in an AWS specific way using the recipe in that environment. So I've got my container, I've got my Redis cache, and then I need to say something about how these things are connected because obviously I want to be able to do that I want to be able to access this from my container. And the way that I can do that is by declaring a connection. Connections are named in Radius because you could have a lot of them. Obviously, you could use more than one thing in your container. So I'll declare a connection. I'm going to name it Redis, and then I'm going to point that to the ID of the database that I just created. So that's this Redis cache that I defined down here. I'm basically linking these two things together. And this connections feature is something kind of unique in Radius. I think there might be a couple other things like this. I think Cloud Foundry had a kind of similar idea, and I think it's a really good idea, which is if you want to link things together, it should feel like magic to do that. What declaring this connection is going to do is, first of all, it's going to declare some environment variables. So I will get settings injected into the app that I can use to access it. What those settings are depend on the technology I'm using. You can find all this info in our docs, by the way. So for like a Redis cache, it's going to be things like the URL of the server, the username, the password, the things that I would need to authenticate against it. For cloud vendor specific services, like let's say an AWS S3 bucket or an Azure storage account, if they support a managed identity or IAM or one of those kinds of flavors of technology, we can actually automate that for you. So if I put a storage account in here instead of a Redis cache, I could say, hey, I need to connect to the storage account and I need read access. And Radius would kind of just make it happen for you. If you've tried to set up managed identity in the past, you probably know that well, it's the most secure way to do it, but it's also probably one of the hardest ones to troubleshoot. Our idea with Radius is let's just make this declarative for developers. You tell us what level of permission you need and what you want to connect to. We're going to do all the plumbing for you because there is a lot of plumbing required. It's one of the things that we do. The other thing that we do here with this connection, I realize there's a lot of things, is we document this connection. So we talked a little bit about documentation. Earlier, we talked a little bit about this concept of the deployable application graph or deployable application diagram. We capture all of the connections that you declare in this API that we call the application graph. And so once you've deployed the application, you can actually query that. And you can see these are all the things that made up my application and how they're connected. This is getting really good responses from people we show it to. They actually want to do a lot of things with it. It's an API, so you can build your own tooling for it. We'll show kind of a text mode version of it. We're working on an actual visualization of it. I'll probably have something to show there in a couple weeks. The idea is that if you're somebody that supports an application, so maybe you're in kind of an SRE or operations role, depending on what you call it on your team, you may not really understand the applications you're supporting very deeply. So wouldn't it be great if we could use the actual code as the source of truth for that documentation? And so all of the people who deeply understand the application, who designed it, who architected it, it's their job to describe it. We make that part of the deployment. And then when somebody has to support the application or troubleshoot it later, you get an up-to-date picture that's shared across everybody that tells you how the developers thought about this application. It's something a little bit different than describing, say, the deployment order of the resources. We're actually describing how they communicate, which is something I don't think we've seen other tools do. Usually when other tools do that, it's kind of like an external manual effort. We're trying to build that in so that it's automatic for you. So this is actually done. We've got our container. We've got our Redis cache. We've got the connection between the two. And if there are no questions, I'm going to go ahead and deploy this. So I'm getting a little bit of lag on the console. Not super fun.
It's all good. I'm just keeping an eye on the clock as well.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
apologies. Let's try and rush you.
I'm running this with rad run app.bicep. This is going to run in my local environment. You can see this is in workspace local dev. So this is going to deploy to that Kubernetes cluster that's inside my code space here.
I was going to ask. Yeah, sorry. So Bicep, from my experience, is something that we deploy to in Azure, right? It's a DSL, domain specific language. But you've got it running inside of a local cluster, right? As part of, or is Radius doing the magic and going, hey, I know what it is in Bicep, but I know how to translate that right to my local cluster.
Oh, this is such an interesting topic. So we've been working with the team that works on Bicep. I know we're short of time, but it's such an interesting topic. We've been working with the team that works on Bicep now for a couple of years. And one of the things that we're doing in partnership with them is we've actually got a copy of their code, and we're running it inside Radius. And we're working with them to open source that part of it. So if you're familiar with Bicep as a technology, you know that the compiler and the tools are being developed in open source, primarily with Azure as an audience. We're working with them to open source the back end of it. So you'll be able to execute Bicep code without an Azure subscription, without using Azure, even having an account. And so, as you can plainly see, we're using Bicep to do all kinds of things. We're not just using it to do Azure. So we're actually going to use Bicep to do AWS a little bit later in this demo. And I'm using it to do Radius. So we really like the work that they're doing as a team. We're kind of taking it out of the Azure context. So far, the community reaction to this has been very positive. I think for folks that are very deep in the Kubernetes CNCF ecosystem, they have some questions when they see it, when they spend a little bit of time playing with it. The feedback's been really, really positive, just on the quality of the tooling, the way it feels like to use, the feedback that it gives you, the way it does validation. I've been surprised with how positive the feedback has been so far. If you try it out and you don't like it, I'd love to hear from you, actually, because I'd love to understand what you thought and what your experiences were. So this is running, I think, through the magic of code spaces. I did this command rad run. It's giving us logs here, and it's opened the app. Through the magic of code spaces, I've got a browser tab to a port forward, to a Kubernetes cluster, to a code space. It's all very nested. And I'll just show this really quickly. If you do our tutorial, you're going to see kind of the same thing. We can reason about that connection, so we can see some of the settings that were injected here. None of these are actually secret, by the way, because this is just on my local code space. So we can understand that the connection got injected into this container. If we flip over to the to-do list, and I don't know why this is lagging. I think it's because the video. I'll say, try this out on code to cloud. I'll add a to-do item for that. If we flip back over to the app, we can see that this actually made it to the database. So we've got a log here from Redis that's showing us that actually got deployed to the database. So pretty cool. I think I can mark this as complete and delete the item. We prove that that's working. If I flip back to the code space, I can terminate my console and get it back. So everything we've done so far has kind of been in this code space. I think the next thing that I would do is, if I wanted to take this to the cloud, I might figure out where I should deploy this for production and how I should deploy it. I think for a lot of folks, the answer is probably GitOps today if you're on the cutting edge. I think some people are still doing like a GitHub Actions, Azure Pipelines kind of thing. But I think for a lot of folks, that's GitOps. We're still kind of figuring out our story with GitOps. It's something we're looking for input from the community on. We know that a lot of folks are using Argo, a lot of folks are using Flux. That's something that we kind of figured out late that we had just gotten wrong. Like that's what a lot of people are doing now. We weren't paying attention, and we're kind of trying to catch up there and figure out how Radius interacts with that. We'd love some people to help us figure that out. Again, we're doing open source, so we're open about where we've misunderstood something. And so I might, imagine that I'm going to check this into a GitOps repo, and then some automation is going to pick it up and deploy it. Or I might be doing traditional CI/CD, and I have some pipelines that are going to deploy it to some environments I have access to. We're not actually going to do that in this demo. I'm just going to run it at the command line. And the way that I would deploy this is, if I wanted to target different environments, I've actually got those environments already kind of mapped in here. I did this before when I was setting up the demo. You can see that I've got the local dev workspace that I've been working with before. I've got an AWS environment, and I've got an Azure environment. If I wanted to deploy to these, I would say rad deploy app.bicep w prod Azure or prod AWS, whichever one I want to go to. Now, spoilers, I've already done this because spinning up our new Redis cache in those environments might take a couple minutes. So I've already done this before the demo to kind of save everybody's time. What I'm going to do instead is I'll prove to you that I've done it. And instead of running the app, I'm going to show you what Radius did. I'm going to show you what the recipes did. And that'll help us reason about the fact that we've deployed to two different environments. So I'll run this other command, rad app graph. that's going to show us what we call the app graph. I'll do this first on Azure. And so I'll explain this because it's a little bit complicated. So for this application, I've got the container called demo that matches what I put in the file. I've got the Redis cache called DB, again, anchoring to what I know, what I put in the file. And then you can see that I've understood the connection. So Radius understood the connection between this container and this Redis cache. Likewise, you can see here the list of resources. Kind of think of this as like, what is the thing made of? So when we did the deployment, what did Radius create on your behalf? That's all this stuff, right? When I defined that container, Radius created all these things in Kubernetes. When I defined this Redis cache, I was using a recipe that created an Azure cache for Redis. If we do the same thing for AWS, we're going to see the same overall architecture, but different resources. And I realize that not everybody swaps out infrastructure. From our customer conversations, it's exceedingly rare, actually, to deploy the same application to multiple clouds. You can also think of this as like, well, no matter where you're going, Radius is going to help you, which is a big part of our motivation for doing multi-cloud. This picture is overall the same, but you can see that we've got an AWS MemoryDB cluster and subnet group because I was using a recipe that did that. And so you could sort of think about like, well, as a developer, I didn't have to choose these recipes. I didn't have to know them. Whoever's responsible for platform engineering or operations, maybe it's a security ops team, they're the people who chose the recipes and wrote them. They're the people who enabled them in the environments that I'm deploying to. I just said that I needed a Redis cache, but then when the app got deployed, I got exactly what I was supposed to get based on the experts who understand that part of the world. And I think we'll stop there with the demo unless we've got more questions. I realize we went pretty long.
I think we need to get you back because
Okay.
it's like the tip of the iceberg, and I really, really want to know more. I really do. I think we need to have a follow-up session because I can see where the worlds are going to collide, right?
Yeah.
Folks like myself who would have wrote those recipes, right? Secure, repeatable fashion, to then, the developer point of view of I just want to get the servers up and running, right? So I can run my code at the end of the day, right? In the most easiest, simplest way. And I learned something new about Bicep. I must have missed the memo on that, right? With it starting to bleed over into other areas. I'm gonna have to speak to Alex about that, right? Next time I see him. But I'm blown away. Where can folks find you? Where can we get started? I know we've got the links here. Radapp.io. Aaron, do you want to?
Yeah, check out radapp.io. It'll link you into everything you need from docs to blog to all of our social media accounts. We're on both X and on Threads, getting into the Fediverse. If you have questions, want to just chat with us, have ideas, want to talk about contributing, want to talk about just how to get it up and running, troubleshooting, like anything at all, go check out our Discord server. I have this open all the day, all throughout the day, and we have a lot of really great conversations there. And then on GitHub, you can go visit our project, our organization on GitHub, follow us and star us there, and keep up to date with our latest releases.
That's awesome. I would go and join the Discord server. I'm on there. I think it was you, Aaron. Yes, they shared the roadmap, right? Was it you? Yeah, shared the roadmap.
Yeah, it was all, we all put it together and we got the announcement out.
Yeah,
go and check it out. It's probably the fastest way of you getting the updates, right? And speaking to the folks in the community. But yeah, again, I am going to try and get you guys back because I feel like there's so much more I want to see, right? And there'll be so much more that others want to see. I think it's going to be a really powerful tool.
awesome.
Yeah, I just want to say thanks to everyone that's turned up, done the demo, gave us the talk, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Yeah, thanks so much for having this. This was a ton of fun.
Thank you,
All
Kevin.
right. Thanks again. Bye for now.
Yeah.